the moment. Here we
Oh.
got it. Okay, everything's good.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Vadim.
Thank you. Scene one, take two, yeah? Okay. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so as I was sharing in terms of critical thinking, I wanted to bring you through quite a few things today for this evening. And one is really about having a common understanding of what critical thinking is by using a common definition for all of us, right? And from there to understand why is critical thinking important for KM. Once we understand that and we start to appreciate the value of critical thinking in KM, then we can start to unpack further in terms of what are the components of critical thinking and what are the factors that we need to be mindful of, which would affect the quality of our critical thinking. I would then further like to share a case study that I'm working on, an actual client that we are supporting, where we are strengthening the way the organization thinks at the individual team and organizational level as they go through a strategic planning process. And by then, we would like to have a breakout activity to get to harness the wisdom within this room in terms of things that you would like to share with all of us when it comes to critical thinking. And then lastly, I would like to end with sharing some best practices that you might want to consider, including maybe a tool, a critical thinking tool that you could use for any of your work in wherever you might be. Okay, so that's my focus for today. And as I mentioned, let's start off with perhaps a common understanding of what critical thinking is. There's a lot of definitions out there, but I like this one because in essence, when you read it carefully, critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by your observation, your experience, your reflection, your reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. Okay, very long definition, but in a way, trying its very best to encompass all that critical thinking requires for us. And this is a definition by the National Council for Excellence in Critical Thinking. Okay, so now that we have a common understanding of critical thinking in terms of a definition, I like to make it simpler for all of us. To me, if I were to ask to describe what critical thinking is, it's about being able to cut through all the noise that we are dealing with. And when I say noise, it's a lot of unnecessary or a lot of things that distract us from being able to find the truth. Okay, and that could be a lot of information that might not be useful or information that might not be true. Okay, so I just like to mention it as about cutting through all the noise to find the truth. Right? So we now come to why. Why is critical thinking important? And the reality is we all, as human beings, we all have the ability to think. However, being humans, we are also subjected to a lot of human nature, which is basically the need, the biases that we hold, mental models that we carry, being prejudiced based on how we have evolved or developed in the society that we are, or being uninformed, or sometimes being partial, right? So the challenge of for critical thinking is when you are heavily affected by all this noise, this biases, this prejudice, this lack of information. This is where it will impact the quality of our thoughts. And the quality of our thoughts, of course, will have a huge impact on the quality of our life, right? So this is why. Okay. So, you know, in a way, if let's try to understand this, how does critical thinking affect KM? And this is where I would also encourage you to share your thoughts on this, because this is how I see it, right? And the way I see it is that critical thinking is a very effective component and is very essential to effective learning. And when I say learning, it's at the individual, the team, and organizational level. So if we looked at this simple cycle where KM, and if we have good knowledge management, which includes great data, insights, knowledge, and then eventually leading to wisdom, right? This would help to enable the organization to learn better. And the outcome of that is, of course, to attend to your business outcomes if you are a company. All right. So usually businesses will invest in KM, right? And then with the hope that through this investment in KM, that individuals, teams, and organizations will be able to learn better. And because they are able to learn better, there is an outcome that they will achieve, which is basically a business outcome, giving the company a competitive edge. Now, the challenge that I often see for KM teams in organizations, especially here in Singapore, in the last few years, maybe about a decade ago, it used to be very big. You used to have a lot of organizations with very big KM teams, but it has died off because the KM teams are not able to demonstrate the link between the investment in KM and achieving the business outcome or the competitive edge, right? So something that we all need to be mindful of as practitioners is this, that if we fail to apply critical thinking at the various levels, be it at the individual, team, or organizational level, and we allow biases, prejudice, information, lack of information, partiality coming into the decision-making of your organization, then it has a huge impact and implication on your business achieving your competitive edge. All right, because the key decisions are made with a lot of, in a way, the term I say, with a lot of noise. There is no quality decision making because the critical thinking is impacted. Okay, at this point in time, any questions from anyone in terms of what I'm sharing and why I believe critical thinking is important for KM? Okay so far? Wonderful, great. Can I also just ask a question and just throw it out onto the chat? Are there any other reasons that you think critical thinking is important for KM? Right, feel free to throw it into the chat, or if you want to speak, it's also okay. Are there other reasons than what I've shared here that you believe critical thinking is important for KM?
And maybe it's critical for every knowledge worker in the new era. We see the skill when we have an overflow, a flow of knowledge and information, and we have so many biases. So the ability to better decide upon them, to better use the knowledge, is relevant to every knowledge worker. And we, as methodologists of knowledge management, must teach them how to better use their information knowledge. And therefore, critical thinking should be our tool, not only for ourselves, but to teach all knowledge workers.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Can't agree more on that, Moria, definitely, because every knowledge worker is a key cog in the whole wheel of the organization, right? And if every knowledge worker is not able to think critically and surfacing up decisions or key inputs that are not critically thought through, it has an impending impact on the entire organization. Okay, and I see some of you have
Stanley, there are a lot of responses, so please respond to them. Yes.
Of course, will do. Yes, great stuff. Folks, keep it coming. Yes, Manfred, yeah, not to be tricked into false developments. Yes, social media is full of conflicting information too. Absolutely, a lot of fake news. What is the truth right now, right? Because not all information valid for decision making. True, a lot of it could be noise that is disrupting us from proper critical thinking. Okay, it's critical because it helps us to not stop in our development. We should be as passionate as we can to find a better way to use our knowledge. Wonderful. Rethinking existing processes contains critical thinking. Yes, right? You need to critically think too as you go through a business process re-engineering, for example. Okay, that could be one of the potential reasons why people resist changing processes, because it's hard. It's hard to think critically. It takes up energy and effort. Critical thinking is an aspect of sense making. Wonderful. Good. Keep it going. I won't read through all, but I'm liking what I'm seeing here. We could all benefit from the wisdom within the room here. All right. Okay. Yes. And critical thinking helps transform information into knowledge, right? It makes sense of the things. Wonderful. Okay. Good. Let me move on to the next part. Okay, we've talked about why critical thinking is important for KM, and now I would like to break it apart. Okay, what are the components of critical thinking? And actually, there are two to it. The first one is about the knowing piece, which is really you have a set of information and you have belief and you generate and you are processing this information, right? Then there's also the doing piece, the habit based on what you are committed to do of using certain skills to guide certain behavior, right? So this is in a nutshell trying to unpack something very complex, but comes as second nature to a lot of us, just for you to take note, the knowing and the doing. But I want to go more into the next segment, which is really to help us understand what are the factors that would affect us in terms of thinking critically. And this is something that a lot of you might be familiar with, or you have seen this before, biases, all right? And there's a fantastic infographic that you can see on the left, very small there, but they mapped about 50 cognitive biases that we may end up having either at the individual or the group or the organizational level. And I intentionally took out about 4 of this that I find quite common as we go through critical thinking, all right? The issue of groupthink. When group teams and leadership go through a decision-making process, they may fall into the trap of groupthink, okay? Because there might be a desire for everyone to conform in order to not to break the harmony of the group or to minimize conflict. This is especially so if you have a leadership team that doesn't have the foundations of psychological safety, right? So groupthink might be a key cognitive bias that may happen in key decision-making in teams. The other common bias that I also see is what we call confirmation bias, okay? Where, you know, we tend to start to look for news or information that confirms what we already believe in. And you see that in social media today, right? There's algorithms that we have that continues to reinforce whatever we are looking for, all right? I might be looking for a used car and on the internet, and I Google used car. And the next thing I know, when I go back to my Facebook feed, all the used car advertisement starts to pop up. It starts to reinforce whatever I'm looking for. So this is also a challenge for us as a knowledge worker, especially in today's world where social media may help to reinforce certain perceptions that are wrong or fake news, right? So we need to be mindful of this, okay? The confirmation bias. Next is what we call the framing effect, where, you know, when we are presented with certain information, we might often draw different conclusions from the same information, depending on how it's presented, okay? Just to fit what we believe in, all right? So be mindful of this. And lastly, one of the other biases that I wanted to highlight for all of us to take note of is survivorship bias, focusing on things that survive a process and often overlooking ones that fail. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this World War II learning in terms of planes that survive being hit by machine gun. And they studied the patterns of the dots on the plane, and they felt that they needed to reinforce those areas that had the bullet holes, when actually it was wrong, because those that survived were those that could still make it through even though there were holes in the wings, right? So be careful of things that we are letting go, knowledge that we are letting go, if we are not learning from things that have failed, also overlooking things that have failed. Okay, at this point in time, can I also just check in whether are there other biases that you are familiar with that might have, you know, you might have encountered that affects your work as a KM practitioner? Thank you for that, Jan. Thank you for the cheat sheet. Wonderful, great. Any other biases that you often deal with when you are dealing as when you're working as a knowledge practitioner in the organizations that you either consult or you support? What are the common biases that you deal with? Feel free to share.
Anchoring bias.
Anchoring bias.
The first one that you saw affects us more.
Yeah, it's a bit small here, but anchoring bias. Yeah, wonderful. Anyone else with any other common biases that you see, that you have observed as you do this work? Okay, optimism bias, yes. Language bias, yes. Authority bias, thanks, thank you. Wonderful. So these are things that when I started off doing KM many years ago, I was not mindful of, but now much more cognizant of this and designing conversations for individuals and teams to think critically in order to be able to ensure that we remove as much of the biases that may impact good decision making. Okay, so be mindful of this. There's 50 over. There's no way you can memorize everything, but I think what would be good is designing conversations to help to remove some of these biases. Okay, all right. Now that we are more mindful of biases and that there are like 50 over forms of it, okay, I also like to share about this approach, and this is a source from Joshua.com, where we talk about, as a knowledge worker, right, we are dealing with explicit and implicit knowledge, and it's a range of it, right? And there are pieces of work that we do as a knowledge practitioner, be it in terms of delivering outputs or expertise that we provide. And it ranges from explicit to implicit. It would mean, like, for example, events are very high on the explicit, but there are still implicit components. And expertise that we have are often very implicit, but of course, there is still the explicit component, but the range is as such, right? So as a knowledge practitioner, okay, we might be dealing with quite a number of these things. And a lot of this you are familiar with, for example, communities of practice, content management, collaboration tools, self-publishing, so on. And there's a whole lot more of activities. And you would find that, for example, in the activity or the event that we are running, we are dealing with both explicit and implicit knowledge. What then becomes a challenge if we don't pay attention to critical thinking? If we are not, for example, as an individual professing an expertise, we are not a good critical thinker, and we start to become explicit with what we are sharing as our knowledge. That also has an impact to the rest of the group. Okay, so this is something that I would often encourage KM practitioners to be mindful about. Whatever events you are dealing with that deals with both explicit and implicit, we need to be mindful of how we can strengthen critical thinking at each of these sessions. Okay, questions, anyone? Okay so far? All right, moving on. Okay, so what happens if we are not deliberate in applying critical thinking at any step? Anyone with any, your thoughts on this particular question? What could happen if we are not deliberate in applying critical thinking at any step of our work as a KM practitioner? Is this something that you pay attention to in your current work? Wonderful. Wasting resources, yes. May not deliver what is expected by the end user, definitely, yeah. Misunderstanding processes and knowledge gaps, yes. And as KM practitioners, we are mindful of things like knowledge gaps, right? We need to watch out for them. Yes, wonderful. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for those who have shared your thoughts on this. This is, if you have not paid attention to critical thinking in your work, I would strongly suggest you to start to become more mindful of this. And thank you, Paul. Small error becomes a massive problem. It goes to scale, right? A poorly thought of decision could lead to a massive, massive problem. All right, moving on. Okay, so what about the techniques of critical thinking? Okay, this is where, if you are a KM practitioner, how do I go about strengthening my own critical thinking process? Or how do I go about strengthening critical thinking for teams, for organizations that I work in? Okay, I would say that there are probably 7 steps that you can consider going through. Of course, if you Google, there might be others, but I found this 7 steps quite useful for me. And the first one is what we call identify the problem or question. And I'll unpack each of them in a little bit more detail subsequently. The second step is after you have identified the problem with the question, then you want to gather data, opinions, and arguments, all right, pros and cons, and then start to analyze and evaluate the data before you start to identify assumptions or biases. A lot of time, people skip step 4, okay? Because we all assume that we are thinking logically, we have no assumptions, we have no biases. But step 4 is often a step that most humans would skip. Then step 5 is about establishing what is the significance from what we have analyzed here. Okay, before number 6, we make a decision. And lastly, to be able to present our thoughts or to communicate our thoughts. Okay, so these are the 7 techniques to it, 7 steps to it. And I'll just unpack each of this for us to take a look. Okay, there's a little bit of explanation for each of the steps. For example, if you are dealing with a problem, you want to be able to identify what exactly is the problem that you're dealing with. And it can be a very broad problem, but you want to narrow it as much as possible, because the broader it is, the more complex it becomes, the harder it is to deal with it, right? Then the second one is about gathering data, opinions, and arguments. You want to find sources that present different ideas and viewpoints. And this is the part that I often teach some of my workshop participants. Check your reference and sources. Some of us take only from one source of references. So for example, I might be interested in transformation, but I only read from Harvard Business Review. And all my readings are from Harvard Business Review. Then you are not getting different viewpoints and ideas. You want to read extensively, right? 3, are the sources reliable? Once you start analyzing them, you need to ensure that your conclusions are data-backed. Okay, are the conclusions data-backed or just someone expounding their viewpoint? Okay, is there enough information to support the hypothesis that's being put forward? Right. Number 4, if you start to identify your assumptions or biases, are you sure yourself that the sources that you got your information from, are they themselves free from bias, or what are the biases that they are dealing with? And were you even biased in your search for answers? Oh, I only like to read from this source, so I only read this. Okay. And then number 5, if you have established significance, what piece of information is most important? Is the sample size sufficient? Are all opinions and arguments even relevant to the problem you're trying to solve, and so on? Okay. And then before you go into making a decision, weighing strengths and limitations of all options, and lastly, presenting to stakeholders. The reality is we tend to skip through some of these steps. One is probably because of convenience. As humans, right, we try to minimize how much energy we expend or effort we expend. So we try to cut short through a lot of the thinking process. Okay, so be mindful of this. If you start to train yourself to step by step think critically like this, over time you will find that you are able to think critically in a very short span of time, very fast, but in a very methodical manner. All right. So let's try to go through this technique with an example. Okay, so going through the example, we have the 7 steps. And the first one is, let's identify a problem or question. Okay, perhaps the problem we want to think about or try to solve is drinking coffee good for you? But that's such a broad problem, right? Or broad question. Let's narrow it down further. Let's narrow it down to, is drinking coffee good for your heart? Okay, so now if we bring this and we have identified the problem or question and we've narrowed it down, we go to the second step, which is gathering data. And we've got 2 research findings that we managed to find. One saying that drinking coffee could account for premature deaths in the region of 14% for coronary heart disease and 20% for stroke. That's research number 1. Another research that we managed to find has a different perspective. it says that moderate coffee consumption was associated with a lower prevalence of the coronary artery disease. Two different findings, right? So what are the mistakes that we are making here? We've made two major mistakes in reasoning. First of all, we assume two research sources was enough. Perhaps seeing that they are both different perspectives, right? We needed more. We probably need to look for more sources. The next mistake we put and make in this step is that we didn't take into account that actually the heart that we are dealing with is a very, very complex organ. Okay, it might be that coffee might be good for some of its function, but also has some bad impact for some of its functions. So we can't be very straightforward and say that it only has good or bad. It could be good and bad. Okay, so this is a step where people often find a challenge. They might go straight away to two research pieces and say that's enough, and simplify things too easily. Okay, so this is at step 2, gathering data, opinions, and arguments. Now, if we go to step 3, analyzing it, what we have realized is that when we look at the two articles, they have, of course, appeared in prestigious peer-reviewed journals. However, the first one, which was talking about could account for premature deaths, right, was only based on literature review. It was not a study on its own. While the second one, although it's conducted with over 25,000 participants, men and women, it's only for the Korean population. Okay, so it might not be representative of the entire human community, right? Because climate, diet, all that are other factors. Now, do you see where the challenges are as we think critically through this problem statement that we pose to ourselves at the start? Okay, then we go to step 4, which is identifying assumptions and biases. While the two sources that we looked at don't appear biased, we ourselves were. Why? Because when we went to search for it, we typed in on Google certain assumptions, reasons not to drink coffee, okay, because we assume coffee is bad, and also we type reasons to drink coffee, assuming coffee is worth drinking. Just the way we type our research can actually lead us to a certain findings, which is of course based on your Google search algorithm, okay, which reinforces our own assumptions research, or what we call the framing effect. Do you see now where it is leading, right? At this stage, we might be reinforcing what we are looking for. Okay, and when we go to step 5, establishing the significance, when we've looked through all that, we can positively state that the information we gathered is really not significant enough to solve the problem that we initially stated, because it's not comprehensive enough. There were some biases in terms of how we have surfaced some assumptions as we search for the data and so on. Okay, any other person would have just said that based on reading those two articles, they have made a conclusion. But because we have taken the rigor of going through these steps, we realize that actually we can't take those two research articles. It's not conclusive enough. Okay, and this is where we make a decision that according to whatever data we've gathered, which is the two sources, in drinking coffee might be good and might be bad. And it depends on a lot of factors, which we are not able to take into account based on what we've researched so far. Okay, and that will lead us to the last step, which is our conclusion. We can't answer the question that we pose ourselves at this point. Okay, all right, just a very simple question statement, just to bring us through this step. Do you realize that just going through this critical thinking 7 steps, that we are now starting to be aware of some of our biases, some of our assumptions, some of our lack of rigor in identifying research to address some of the questions that we had? Great. Okay, can you start to imagine if you were to deal with a certain problem, okay, or if you had come to your leadership, the leadership team that you're working with has made a decision. Has their decision been based on a more critical thinking process, or have they skipped any of these steps? And what are the implications that they're seeing, right? I'm sure you can start to imagine how this would pan out if individuals or teams start to skip some of these steps. Okay, It could be like, for example, gathering data or opinions. I could just listen to one of my teammates instead of hearing from everyone. Okay, and I assume that one person is enough to give me enough information to make a decision. Okay, all right, great. Any questions at this point in time? Are we okay so far with the technique, the 7 steps? Wonderful, great. Okay, now I'm going to share with you a case study, an actual piece of work that I'm working on right now with an Institute of Higher Learning, where they have asked us to help them in their strategic planning process. Okay, so they go through this cycle every 5 to 10 years of creating what they call a transformation vision of what they need to be in the next 5 to 10 years. And they go through a strategic planning process. A little bit more about this organization. It's dealing with about 14,000 full-time students, 3,000 part-time students, which are often adult learners, and they have about 3,000 staff. So usually their planning cycles is based on a 10-year cycle. And the strategies were often in the past. This is their 5th planning cycle, right? They have about a 50-year history, right? They were often developed by the strategy unit or team that's within the organization. And the strategy team will do their own research and then present on these are the strategies we need to do in the next 5 to 10 years. And the C-suite or the leadership will say, okay, we agree, or change this, change that. Okay, and once they decide on the strategies will cascade across the organization. What kind of a challenge do you think will naturally happen if they were to follow this process? Small team, do their research, small team, develop the strategies, leadership agree on the strategies, leadership cascade. We've just gone through the 7 steps. What would be some challenges? All right, feel free to put it out there as I also share with you some of the challenges that was happening to that. Okay. Groupthink, one foot, one thread. Yes, groupthink. And this is where they start to see over time. They used to be the Institute of Higher Learning of first choice among their peers. But they are starting to see a falling enrollment of top students. Top students were no longer choosing them as the organization or as the institution to go to. They were also starting to see very high attrition rates of their staff, and the projects starting to fail. The project that they wanted to starting to fail. Wonderful, Katrina. Did they ask the students? Absolutely. And you all are getting the point. Decisions were made in silos without asking the right stakeholders, and this could include students, right? All right, bandwagon effect in decision making, top-down approach. Leaders may not have all the answers. Absolutely, especially in today's VUCA world, leaders don't have all the answers, right? So we were engaged to guide them through a strategic planning process so that they could deal better with VUCA, right? Okay. So what are the key factors that we've identified from doing a diagnosis? One, a lot of the content that was captured by the strategic planning team usually conforms to what they think their bosses want to see. Right? I'm sure you have encountered this where, okay, should we put it this way, or should we change the words? If not, our bosses will jump when they read this, right? So it is really conforming to what the bosses see. Okay. The other issue could be decisions made at strategic level were often impacted by cognitive biases that they had at the individual and the team level. And the fundamental reason why this happens is that actually there's a failure to create a safe space for dissenting views. So long as the most influential person says so, everybody conforms. Okay, so this is a key challenge that they have. So what do we do? Okay, we worked with the CEO, and the good thing was he was new into the role, about 1 year in, and he was very open to change. And we shared with him this lack of critical thinking at various levels, both at the individual and the team and the organizational level. And he got on board, and he requested for us to try to open up getting the inputs and the insights, as some of you have mentioned, like the students, alumni, potential students, all right, industries that they work with. So we engaged more than 10 different stakeholders, both internal and external, on what they would like to see of this institution in the future, so that we could minimize what we call the cognitive bias of groupthink. We also ran leadership conversations where we created safe spaces for people to speak up about issues that they feel strongly about without fear of being judged or in a way punished by their bosses, so as to reduce what we call authority bias. Then we went through a whole current reality mapping process where basically we've got leaders from all the different departments and the different schools within the institute to start to map what is their current reality, where we run an exercise for each of them to start to map what is it that they are seeing as issues and challenges. And what we did was we got everyone to submit, and we've got 210 people involved in this submission. And once everyone submitted, we open it up on SharePoint to allow everyone to read each other's current realities. Meaning the CEO could read the senior manager on the ground's current reality, the senior manager on the ground could read the CEO's current reality and what they are seeing. Okay, and this openness allow people to minimize a lot of the blind spot that they have at the individual level. What it also did was to help to raise awareness of blind spots they had at the whole organizational level. Okay, what is it that they're not seeing? Okay, so at this point in time, that was just a quick sharing on the case study. I like to perhaps maybe now request for help to do a simple breakout using the Google slide, and let's harness the wisdom from within this room. What are ideas and on tips and techniques that you have when you try to strengthen critical thinking in your organization, especially in your area of work? And Sagit, thank you so much. Yeah. Yes.
So you can see, everyone can see as usual in the chat. We can find the chat rooms, the link to the file. We'll do it rather fast because Salah, you have very good practices, best practices at the end, and I want us to miss them. So we'll take something like 5 minutes when we start, and let's start. Just a minute. Here we go. Did I create them? Create all rooms. Here we go. We'll come back until the people go in. We'll come back at 10 minutes before the end. You'll have 10 minutes for your best practices and wrapping up. Now, Salah, you stay with me here. Don't go to the room if you were assigned to your room. Please stay with me, because what we will be doing is we will be entering the link, as I told you, and we will be going through the rooms and seeing what people are writing while they are writing. That's really real online collaboration, real online work.
Yes.
So, okay, so you can, do you see the link now?
Yeah.
So please press the,
yes.
Go to the hyperlink.
Got it.
Got it. Okay. Now I see your screen. No, I don't see your sketch, your shared screen, because it was, we'll see it in a minute. I can go into it the same. No, I'll see what you're doing, and therefore we'll be sure we're on the right place. They are very well trained. They did so many times. So, and every time we keep the files one after the other, so everything is later on available. Of course, also, you know, when you go back later on to the room, but let's start. You know what? Did you enter the link, the hyperlink? And you see that you can move from room to room and see what they're writing.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay, another thing that's important, go to the chat again for a minute.
Okay, yeah.
And you see that in the right hand, you have 3 dots.
Yes, yep.
Please press the button. You see, you can save the chat. So if you want additional reasons why it's important, or to read the feedbacks later on, or to use them, you can save the chat to a file and everything will be available.
Great, thank you.
So you have 5 minutes to go through the things and to enjoy.
Okay. Okay. I'm looking through their inputs.
Did you see, Sally, the question of Jan Hutter when they went out to the
Yes, I
to
did.
the-
I did.
yes, about the case study
Yeah,
and
yeah.
using the sense
Sense-making
making?
platform. Yeah. No, I didn't use that, but I'll answer his question later.
So you can write it down here, or you
Oh,
can
yeah,
write
yeah,
and
that's
say,
true. Yeah.
you know, there's so much things to do, so you can decide what channel to use, if to speak or write or whatever.
All right, all right. Yeah, that's true. Wonderful. Good stuff from the teams.
Oh, I knew you enjoy it.
Yeah.
They're really serious people. It's not KM
Yeah.
practitioners, it's KM experienced expert practitioners.
KM experienced expert. That's a keep.
They're also
Okay.
experienced, and they're also experts in there. We called
Yeah,
only
yeah.
the advanced people to come, not to new
Ah,
KMers to join in.
Yeah.
So we didn't stand at the door and say no, yes, no, yes, no, but really that's the people that we encourage to come.
And that of course strengthens the quality of learning within the teams, right? As we have the sessions. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I'll now close the room, so they will have
Okay.
1 more minute
Yeah.
before they have to return.
Yeah. Okay. And I will start to share the screen again. Okay, is everyone back?
It will take a few more seconds.
Being recorded.
Okay, here we go.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Okay, I looked through some of your inputs. Wonderful. I will not go through them because I think they are all gems on their own. Feel free to, of course, look through each other's inputs. I think there's a lot of wisdom in there. All right. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. And the next segment is that we're going to cover is on best practices. And this really is the last few pieces that I'd like to share for today. Okay. Just to check, you can see my slides, yeah? Okay. Wonderful.
Yes, we
Okay.
see it. Thank you.
Great. 4 key things to take note of in terms of best practices, and some of them you have already mentioned in your inputs in the Google Slides. The first one is we need to be deliberate about developing critical thinking as one of your organization's competency framework. And I actually stand corrected. Initially, I put leadership. I think it should be for everyone within the organization. Okay. The second one is, are there frameworks and practices that we can implement so that it will start to minimize any biases that we have as humans at different aspects of the work? Okay, could we design certain questions, certain frameworks so that our people are more deliberate about avoiding some of these biases? The third one, and this is the part that I saw in some of your answers, how do we go about creating psychologically safe environments for differing views to be heard? Very challenging, but if our leaders believe this is important to make sure that we don't lead down the road of groupthink, then we need to ensure that we create psychologically safe environments wherever we are within the organization. And lastly, in terms of, are there tools that we can use that will guide critical thinking? Okay, so best practices, all right, please look into your competency frameworks. And although I put leadership, I think now I stand corrected. It should be a competency for every knowledge worker. Okay, and it should be a core competency for all of us. Secondly, what are frameworks and practices that help to minimize biases? I'm a fan of SAFE. SAFE is a Scale Agile framework because in the framework, it does design some of the work processes to avoid some of these biases. Okay, I can't go into detail here, but something for you to explore if you're looking for a framework and if you're implementing agile teams. How do teams avoid the challenges of biases? All right. Creating psychologically safe, and this is often the biggest challenge. We need to educate our leaders that it is important for the team to be safe to share differing views, dissenting views, and that they will not be judged and they will not be punished if they have different views. Okay, only when leaders understand, then they have to start to take responsibility to create that space. And we need to teach them how to do it because it's not a given that every one of us knows how to do this. And lastly, in terms of tools, and I truly believe that the brain can be trained and guided in terms of how we think critically. Can we think critically better? Okay, so we could introduce tools that would help this critical thinking process, just like what you've gone through in the 7 steps, right? And designing certain guiding questions that can help to assist in developing and sustaining a critical thinking environment. Okay, because at the end of the day, the kind of questions we ask ourselves defines the quality of how we critically think. Okay, you might want to take note of some questions, good and bad questions, and you can refer this to the slide, of course, at the end of the session. Be mindful of the kind of questions you're asking yourself. Are they good questions or are they bad questions? Are they leading questions or are they fixed questions, right? Be more intentional in looking out for the kind of questions we ask, especially in team discussions. And lastly, one key tool that I'd like to share with you that I have here, remember going about the outputs, events, processes, decisions, connections, and expertise, right? Okay, these are some of the kind of questions you could be asking yourself as you go through some of these activities or actions. Okay, for example, if you're going through your KM process, what's the step we are taking in terms of identifying and selecting a particular output or process? Okay, why did we choose it? So asking ourselves some of these questions will help to raise our awareness of some biases that we hold in terms of why did we even choose this particular process in the first place. Okay, so these are questions that I often ask myself when I'm working through either outputs, events, processes, decisions, connections, and expertise to try to raise my own awareness of biases that I may hold as I do some of this work. Okay, and you can design your own tools. The questions you ask should be designed in a way to raise awareness of biases that we may have so that we can avoid them or minimize them. All right. Okay. Some gentle reminders. It's not necessarily a gift that's blessed only for certain people. We can train ourselves in it. Okay. There are leaders, of course, who say, I trust my gut, but the gut may be part of the noise. Okay. Use data, and ascertain the data is good, right? And of course, communicate with others. Don't often think in silos. When often we think and make decisions on our own, we fall into the trap of thinking in silos. Okay. And of course, lastly, to celebrate successes. Whenever we have success in applying some of these frameworks and the way we think critically is getting some outputs and outcomes, celebrate those, because then it encourages the rest of our organization to continue applying the frameworks and routines that we put in place to strengthen critical thinking. Okay. All right. With that, 4 minutes to 9 for my time. Moira, over to you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Oh, also, both, first of all, a great session. Second, it was connected. Also, it was for the knowledge worker and also for us as knowledge managers, great connection. And third, standing on time, even though there were so many questions. So thank you very much on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone have a great KM day, night, evening, wherever you are. Bye all.
Bye.
If there's anyone with questions that want to stay, Sally and I are staying here another 4 minutes.
No problem. Yep. Here.
I think it was all clear. It was very methodical. And Manfred says yes, and Manfred is very strict when he asks for things, right? Now smile, smile, Manfred.
Thank you, Manfred.
No, I'm just joking.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your all your knowledge and wisdom too. I'm also learning it. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Anwar, thank you very much. It was a brilliant
Hi,
session.
Rudolph. Yes, thank you so much. Good to see you again.
Good learning. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you.
So you see, Rudolf is from India, Manfred is from Austria, John here is from the US, Rinat is from Israel, Phil is from US. I'm seeing people from so many places. Shruti is, I don't remember, Shruti, where do you come from? Rajesh from Singapore, Emmanuel from Indonesia, right? And I'll stop before I make mistakes. Rajesh, good seeing you too.
Hi. Semester is over, so I have no more Tuesday classes.
No more Tuesday classes. Okay.
Oh, yes. Okay. All right.
Okay, I think that there are no
Thank you and
questions.
bye-bye. Huh? Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Ali. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you, Moira. Moira, thank you so much.
Thank you, Saleh.
Take care.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
Philip.